Wyoming Territory, August 1879, the first time Jackson Grady saw her, she was standing outside the general store in Laramie, hands clenched at her sides. Eyes fixed on the postboard like it might grant her a miracle. She looked half-starved. Dust clung to her skirts, her dark brown hair was pulled tight away from a face too pale for high summer. She was asking the storekeep for work anything, washing, mending, sweeping. She spoke softly, but Jackson heard her as he passed by with a coil of rope over his shoulder and sweat on his brow. "No work for you here," the storekeep muttered, not unkind but final. She nodded once, didn't argue. She just stepped back and stood there as if she hadn't anywhere else to go. Jackson slowed, then stopped altogether. He was not the kind of man who usually got involved. 32, quiet, worked cattle for a living, kept to himself on his little spread west of town. He had known hard times, but whatever she was walking through looked worse. She looked like grief walking around in skin. "You from around here?" he asked, voice low. She turned, startled. Her eyes were a steady green and they leveled with his with no flinching. "No, sir, just passing through. You got folks?" She shook her head. "No, sir, just me." "Name?" "Virginia Zeller." "Jackson Grady." He said it because it felt right, because her name should not go unanswered. She nodded, polite. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he asked. "Anything. I can clean, cook a little. I do not need much." Something in her voice, that tired edge of pride, like she had been holding herself upright too long, sat heavy on his chest. "You got a place to stay?" She hesitated. "No, not really." Jackson looked away down the dirt street, then back at her. "I got a barn, clean, dry. You can stay there a while. I'll find something for you to do." She went still. "You do not even know me. Do not need to." "I got eyes." People were beginning to look. He did not care. Virginia swallowed hard. "I do not want charity. Not offering it. I need help on the ranch. You need a place, that's fair." She looked at him for a long moment and he let her. Then she nodded once, slow. "All right." Jackson hitched his wagon and helped her up. She did not say much on the way out of town, and neither did he, but the silence between them was not heavy. It just was. His ranch sat quiet up against the edge of a pine ridge with a shallow creek running through the back. The house was small, one-story, wood grade by sun. The barn was bigger, solid, and clean like he promised. She stepped down from the wagon and took it in with a single sweep of her eyes. "I can make this work," she said, smoothing her skirt. "I will bring you a cot, some blankets," Jackson said. "There is a pump out back and the outhouse is down past the coop." She nodded. "Thank you." He started to turn away, then paused. "You hungry?" She hesitated. "Yes. I will bring supper out." He did salt pork and beans and bread he had baked that morning. She ate with quiet thankfulness, her hands trembling just a little as she lifted the tin cup of water. "You got a long road behind you?" he asked. She looked at the barn wall, not him. "I lost my husband last spring, Kansas. Fever took him, then the farm failed, there was nothing left." "Just me?" Jackson did not press, he just nodded. "I can work hard," she added. "I do not want to be a burden. You are not." That night he lay awake longer than usual. The barn light had gone out hours ago, but he could still see her face when she looked at him, tired, yes, but not broken. There was something else in her, something that had not been beaten down yet. The next morning, she was already gathering eggs when he came out to hitch the bay mare. She had tied her hair back with a piece of cloth and rolled up her sleeves. "You do not waste time," he said. "No use in it," she replied. She worked steady that week. Cleaned out the chicken coop, mended a fence, cooked supper when he was too tired to lift a spoon. She did not talk much, but when she did, her voice was soft and sure. By the third day, Jackson found himself looking forward to coming in from the pasture. She would be there, brushing her skirts off, or kneeling in the garden she started without asking. One evening, after a long day moving cattle, he found her sitting on the porch step with her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached, and her face softened. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "You did not have to help me." "Most wouldn't. I am not most." She smiled, small and quiet. "No, you are not." He sat down beside her, the boards creaking. The sun was low, staining the sky orange. You ever think about staying? He asked. I do not have anywhere else to go. That ain't an answer. She looked at him then, really looked. I do not want to be a burden. He shook his head. You are not. You are the first thing that has felt right in a long time. She blinked. You barely know me. I know enough. Something flickered in her eyes, not fear, just surprise. I am not expecting anything, he added. But if you stayed, I would not mind. That night, he brought her a lantern for the barn and left it just inside the door. She stood in the light and watched him walk away. The next morning, she made him coffee before he could reach the pot. I will stay, she said, handing him the cup. He took it, his eyes on hers. Good. Days rolled into weeks. She moved from the barn to the house without either of them saying it out loud. Her things few as they were found their way into the cabin. Her shawl on the back of the chair. Her hairbrush on the windowsill. He caught himself waiting for the sound of her footsteps across the porch. They shared meals, shared silence, shared work. And slowly they started sharing more. One night after supper she stood beside him at the fence line, the moon hanging low over the pines. I did not think I would feel safe again, she said. You are safe here. She turned to him. I believe you. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Virginia, he said, her name a steady thing in his mouth. I am glad you saw me that day, she said. So am I. She leaned into him and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. It was not rushed. It was not wild. It was just right. And neither of them pulled away. By late September, the wind had turned sharp, brushing down from the snowy range with a warning in it. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold, and the mornings came cold enough to keep breath suspended. Virginia had taken to wearing one of Jackson's old shirts over her dress when she went out to feed the hens. The sleeves rolled twice at the wrists. One afternoon, he rode back from checking the west fence and found her crouched near the smokehouse, sleeves pushed up, knees in the dirt, splitting kindling with a hatchet too large for her hands. She paused only when he dismounted and stepped near. You could have waited. I would have gotten to it. I saw it needed doing. Jackson set his gloves on the rail post. You always this stubborn? I prefer useful, she replied, brushing wood dust from her skirt as she stood. He didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at the hair near her face and she didn't seem to notice. He reached out and gently took the hatchet from her. It was useful, but next time ask me for the smaller one. She looked up at him, something unreadable in her expression. I didn't think I could. You can. He paused. Anything you need here, you can ask. She nodded once, but her mouth pressed flat, and she turned back toward the house without saying more. That evening, as she kneaded bread at the table, her hands moved with a quiet rhythm, her eyes focused on the dough. Jackson sat near the hearth, oiling his saddle. The scent of yeast and pine pitch mingled in the air, and the firelight softened the edges of the room. You ever thought of hiring on help? She asked, not looking up. Don't need to. Not much stock, and I manage fine. I was thinking of the winter. If it turns hard, it'll be more than one man's work. He set the saddle aside and wiped his hands. You've been through a hard winter before. Her fingers stilled. Yes. He waited, but she didn't go on. Instead, she dusted her palms with flour and reached for the tin of salt. You cooked often? He asked. Only when nobody else would. She glanced at him. My husband wasn't fond of anything I made except biscuits. Well, he said, I'd eat your biscuits year-round. That earned a quiet laugh, the first sound of ease he'd heard from her all day. Later, as they sat on the porch with the last of the daylight, Virginia rested her elbows on her knees and watched a hawk circle above the pasture. I used to think I knew what I was meant for, she said. A small house, a few acres, maybe a child or two. I don't know what I believe anymore. Jackson leaned back, one boot crossed over the other. Maybe it's not about believing, maybe it's just choosing, every day, one thing then the next. I'm not sure I knew how much I lost until it was gone. He didn't answer right away. The crickets had started and the wind moved soft through the grass. I lost my older brother to a bronc, he said finally. 12 years ago, he was the one who taught me to ride. After that, I figured I'd stay alone, seemed safest. She turned toward him. And now, he looked at her steady. Now I think safety's not worth near as much as someone who'll sit beside you when the wind's up. She held his gaze. I'm not easy to be beside. I didn't ask for easy. In the dark, her fingers brushed his, tentative at first, then still. He didn't move, just let their hands rest together on the wood slat between them. When the first frost came, she brought in the last of the beans from the garden and laid them out on a cloth in the kitchen. Jackson watched her from the doorway, the way she lined them neat in rows as if it mattered. You always this careful with things? He asked. I like knowing where something begins and where it ends. He stepped inside, took his hat off, and hung it near the door. And what about us? She turned toward him, hands still. I don't know where we began. I do, he said. That day outside the store. Virginia looked down, then back up. And where do you think this ends? He crossed the room and stopped just shy of her. Where you want it to. She reached for his hand, her grip firm. I want to stay. Then stay. She nodded, her voice quiet. I will. Jackson leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. You're not alone, not anymore. And for the first time since she set foot on his land, her shoulders eased. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The weight she'd carried had shifted just enough to let her breathe. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, and inside the cabin, warmth settled between them. October came with a hush. The light settled low on the land, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. By then, Virginia had taken over the hearth, and Jackson had started setting an extra place at the table without thinking. She'd hemmed curtains for the front window and patched the knees of his work trousers without a word about it. Some days, he'd come in and find her standing at the stove, humming under her breath in a way that made the house feel fuller than it ever had. That morning, she was outside before dawn, hanging washed linens in the cold. He watched her from the porch, coffee cooling in his hand. Her breath came in pale clouds, and her fingers worked fast, knuckles red from the wet, but she didn't flinch from the cold. When she came in, she set the clothespin sack by the door and rubbed her hands slow by the stove. You ever think on what you'd do different if you could go back? She asked, her voice quiet but clear. Jackson set his cup down. Not much good ever came from dwelling on things that won't change. I know, she said, turning toward him. But sometimes I wonder if I missed something. Some turn I could have taken that would have kept me from losing everything. He crossed to the stove and reached for her hands, warming them between his. You didn't miss a turn, Virginia. You made it through. She nodded once, but her eyes stayed on his face. I've been thinking I'd like to write my sister. You never said you had a sister. She's in Tennessee. Married a man who ran a dry goods store. We haven't spoken in a long while, not since before I left. You think she'd want to hear from you? I don't know. But I want her to know I'm safe. Her voice caught slightly, but she steadied it, and that I've found a place. Jackson didn't ask what had happened between them, he just nodded. We'll ride into town next week. You can send a letter from the post. She gave a small nod and turned back to the stove. Later that day, he found her sitting at the table with a scrap of paper and the stub of a pencil, lips pressed together in concentration. He didn't interrupt. That evening, after chores, they sat near the fire, the dog from the neighboring farm curled at their feet. It had taken to following Virginia around when it wandered over, and she never turned it away. Jackson leaned back and looked at her in the firelight. You ever think about marrying again? She didn't answer for a long moment. I did once, after he passed, but I was too deep in grief to trust what I felt. Then came the hunger and the leaving, and I stopped thinking about it altogether. And now, she looked at him, her gaze steady. Now I think I would choose it, but only if it meant being seen for who I am, not pitied, not rescued. Jackson reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You're not a thing to be saved, Virginia. You're a woman I respect. That's different. She exhaled slowly, and something in her expression shifted, less guarded, more sure. If I say yes, it won't be because I need a roof or a meal. It'll be because I want the life that comes with your name. I'd give it to you honest, he said. I know. They didn't speak again that night. She reached for his hand and they sat in the quiet, the fire crackling low, the room warm as a held breath. The next morning, she rose early to bake a pie from the last of the apples they'd traded for with a neighbor. She didn't say why, and Jackson didn't ask. But when he came in from the barn and saw it cooling on the sill, he watched her with a look that said everything. By the end of the week, they rode to town together. She wore her wool shawl, and he guided the wagon over rutted ground with one hand on the reins, the other resting near her knee. At the post office, she handed over the letter with a steady hand, and when the clerk asked for her return address, she gave Jackson's without hesitation. They stopped at the mercantile, and on their way out, he paused at the jeweler's counter. He didn't ask. He just nodded at a plain gold band, and she looked at it for a long time before answering. "All right," she said. They wed 3 days later under the cottonwood by the creek. No preacher, no crowd, just an agreement spoken clear and slow, with the land and the sky as witness. She wore a clean calico dress, and he combed his hair back neat. When she took his hand, she held it like something she'd chosen to keep. That night, she climbed into his bed without hesitation. He held her like she was already his, and she whispered his name as though it meant shelter. By the time the snow came, they moved in rhythm, a pair of hands at the same task, a pair of eyes on the same horizon. Jackson never once thought of the day he found her as luck. It was just the first day of the life they'd built, one piece at a time with both hands. The first heavy snow came down hard and wet, blanketing the pasture in silence. Jackson and Virginia spent the morning hauling water from the creek's edge, breaking through a thin crust of ice. Afterward, they split wood behind the house, their breath curling in the cold. She wore his old wool coat now, sleeves rolled, and the hem nearly kissed the tops of her boots. By midday, the sky had gone a dull pewter. Jackson brought the horses into the lower lean-to, and when he came in, she was setting a kettle over the fire, sleeves dusted with flour. There was a calm in her movement he hadn't seen before, not the kind born of ease, but one that came from knowing her place was steady. He leaned his shoulder to the doorframe. "I was thinking we ought to check the north line fence come next thaw." She stirred the pot slow. "You expecting it to give?" "Not sure, but the elk'll move down if the snow gets worse. They start pressing through, they'll find the low spots." She didn't turn. "I'll go with you." He crossed to the table and started unlacing his boots. "You don't need to come. I want to." She set the spoon down and met his eyes. "I know the land now. I'd rather ride beside you than sit waiting." He nodded once, pulling off a boot. "We'll take the bay and the roan. You still ride strong?" "I do." They ate together while the wind leaned against the cabin. Jackson listened to the sound of her fork on the tin plate, the soft scrape of her chair as she shifted. He liked the way she left a spoon on the counter to cool, always in the same place. That night, she lit a lantern and brought it to the loft where they stored dried herbs and extra linens. He followed, carrying 2 sacks of oats. When they reached the top, she knelt by the shelves, checking the bundles of sage and horehound she'd tied up weeks back. "You're saving more of the medicine plants than I expected," he said, setting the sacks down. "We'll need them," she replied. "You get fevers or cough in this cold, and you'll be glad I did." He crouched near her, resting his forearms on his knees. "You know how to use all that. My mother kept a stillroom, taught me early. I remember more than I thought I would." He watched her fingers trace a jar of dried yarrow. "You miss her?" "Yes," she said, "but I think she would have liked it here." Jackson didn't speak. He reached forward and touched the edge of her sleeve, just enough to let her know he heard. Later, as they lay in bed, the wind rose higher, rattling the shutters. Virginia curled against him, her hand resting near his collarbone. "You ever think about the spring?" she asked. "Sometimes." "What do you see?" He hesitated. "Foals in the pasture, you in the garden, smoke coming from the chimney." She shifted closer. "And after that?" 5 years down the road," he breathed in slow. "I see your name on the land deed beside mine, maybe a cradle by the stove. You still making me that coffee I pretend not to need." She smiled against his chest. "I'd like that." Morning came bitter and white. They saddled the horses and rode out before the sun cleared the ridge. Virginia sat the roan with quiet confidence, her cheeks red from the cold, braid thick down her back. They rode in silence, the snow creaking beneath each step. The north fence held, though some of the rails leaned. Jackson dismounted, pulled off his gloves, and began to brace the worst of it. Virginia stayed mounted, watching the tree line. He glanced up once. "You see something?" "No," she answered, "just listening. The woods feel still." By midday, clouds had thickened again. They turned for home, riding with the wind at their backs. Near the bend by the creek, Jackson slowed. "I used to think this land was mine alone," he said. She didn't answer right away. "And now?" "Now it feels like it's waiting to grow into something we haven't seen yet." She reached across the space between them and touched his arm, her gloved hand light but firm. When they returned, the cabin welcomed them with warmth and the scent of pine kindling. She peeled off her coat, cheeks flushed, and reached for the kettle. "I'll make tea," she said. "You get dry." Jackson stood a moment longer, watching her move through the room like it had always been hers. Then he nodded, peeled off his coat, and leaned near the hearth. She brought him a cup, fingers brushing his as she passed it. He took it, and for a while they sat in the quiet again, the kind that didn't ask anything, only offered space. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, the shape of their life held firm. The snow held through November, piling deep against the fences and settling across the roof in a thick hush. Jackson rigged a pulley for hauling firewood up the slope behind the barn, and Virginia took to drying nettle and pine needles in the loft for winter tonics. Inside, the cabin breathed with warmth, and their days turned quieter, slower, measured not by urgency, but by the soft rhythm of shared labor and close company. One morning, with the wind pressing hard against the shutters and the horses tucked in tight, Jackson glanced at her over the rim of his coffee cup. She sat at the table, sewing a patch onto the elbow of her dress, brows drawn in concentration. "You ever miss the noise?" he asked. Virginia paused, thread caught mid-stitch. "You mean town?" "No," he said, setting the cup down. "Life before, the bustle of neighbors, wagons passing, church bells on Sunday." She considered that, fingers resuming their work. "I used to think I needed it, back when I thought being seen meant being safe. But there's a different kind of safety here, quieter, less borrowed." He nodded, watching the way her hands moved over the fabric. "You feel settled?" "I feel like I'm finally building something that won't vanish come spring." He leaned back, arms crossed. "I thought of putting in a root cellar come thaw, enough room for potatoes, onions, maybe a smoke shelf." "I can help plan it," she said. "My father kept one under the house. Used to send me down with a lantern and a basket. Did it scare you, at first? Then I learned to trust the dark." Jackson stood and crossed to the window. Ice had crept along the edges of the glass, delicate and certain. "You ever think of teaching?" he asked. She looked up. "Children, maybe, or women if someone came out this way needing help. You've got a way of explaining things that sticks." "I wouldn't know where to start." "Most days I'm still remembering what I already knew." "You could start with what you grow, what you sow, what you heal." She smiled, faint but sure. "You think there's someone out here who'd listen?" "I know one already," he said, turning to face her. That afternoon, she brought out a worn book of recipes and remedies she'd carried since Kansas, pages curled from years of use. They sat side by side at the table, heads bent over the paper, her voice steady as she explained the uses of horsemint and willow bark. When she paused to sip broth, he copied her notes in neater script, and she touched his arm in quiet thanks. The days shortened, and they kept busy. Jackson fashioned a cradle from spare pine, smoothing the corners with slow care. Virginia didn't speak when she saw it, just brushed her fingertips along the edge and nodded. No child yet, but hope had started to root, and they both could feel it. One morning, long before light, she woke him with a hand on his shoulder. "There's someone at the door," she whispered. He rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and took the shotgun down from the wall. When he opened the door, a man stood there, shoulders hunched, hat in hand. His coat hung large on a narrow frame, and his beard was patchy with frost. "Name's Elias Moore," the man said. "My wife's sick. Cabin's 5 miles east. I heard you might know a woman who can help. Jackson stepped aside. Come in, warm yourself. Virginia had already lit the lamp. She nodded once at the stranger, then began gathering what she needed. Wintergreen, ginger root, a roll of linen, and a small jar of rendered lard from the shelf. I'll ride with you, she said. I'll hitch the bay, Jackson said, already pulling on his coat. They rode out before sunrise, the wind slicing hard across the flats. Virginia rode steady, one hand on the satchel at her hip. When they reached the cabin, she didn't hesitate, slipping inside and kneeling beside the thin woman on the cot. Jackson waited outside with Elias, keeping the horses warm and the fire fed. By dusk, she emerged, face pale but calm. She'll mend, it'll take time, but her lungs are clear enough. Elias gripped her hand with both of his eyes wet. You saved her. No, she said. You did, coming for help when you did. The ride home was quiet. Snow had started again, light and whispering. Jackson reached across the saddle line and touched her wrist. You did good. I remembered what I needed to. That night they sat close by the hearth, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting over hers. You ever miss who you used to be? He asked. No, she said, but I remember her, I carry her with me. He kissed her temples, slow and sure. I'm proud of you. She turned into him, wrapped both arms around his chest. You're the first place I ever felt like I could stay. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. By spring, the land softened. The creek ran fuller and the sky stretched wider. Virginia planted onions and beans in careful rows, humming as she worked. Jackson tilled the back plot, then built a bench beneath the cottonwood, where they sometimes sat with bread and coffee, watching the light play across the water. In May, a letter came from Tennessee. Her sister's handwriting, stiff but kind, an apology and a hope for reunion. Virginia read it once, then folded it and tucked it in a box beside the hearth. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But that night she fell asleep with her hand on Jackson's chest, fingers curled like roots in warm earth. By midsummer, the cradle sat beside the bed, empty but waiting. Jackson stood one evening near the edge of the pasture, watching the sky. Virginia came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He covered her hands with his own. You ever think we'd end up here? She asked. No, he said, but I can't see myself anywhere else. They stood that way as the sun dipped low, the wind brushing soft through the grass. A hawk passed overhead, silent in its glide. I love you, she said, her voice steady. He turned, brushed her hair back, and kissed her slow. I love you too. They went back inside together, the door swinging shut behind them. The cabin glowed with the last of the light, and the scent of bread cooling on the table wrapped around them like a promise. That autumn, they welcomed a daughter. Born small but loud, with her mother's eyes and her father's hands. They named her Althea after Virginia's grandmother. The cradle held her well. Virginia rocked her by the window in the evenings, singing songs Jackson had never heard. He'd sit nearby, mending tack or whittling, watching the way his wife loved their child with quiet strength. The days passed, full and slow. They never spoke of the road that brought them together. They didn't need to. They'd built something better than what they'd lost, something that would hold. And long after the snow came again, long after the woodpile shrank, their love remained rooted deep, tender and true, grown steady through the seasons.